You're in the middle, David.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wardlaw Museum. Thank you all for coming. My name is Ross Christie, and I'm the Learning and Engagement Manager here at the museum, and I'll be chairing the event this evening. Just some housekeeping before we get started. There are no fire drills planned for the evening, so if the fire alarm does sound, just exit by the way you came in, or follow the instructions from any of the museum staff. If you need to use the toilet, this toilet's just outside here on the left-hand side, and there's more downstairs by the reception. This session is being recorded, both video and audio, but the camera can just pick up myself and the panelists, so you'll not be on screen. But if you do ask any questions later on, they will be recorded. In terms of questions, if you keep any questions to the end, we've got about an hour of pre-prepared questions, and then time at the end for you to ask anything you'd like to ask. But without any further ado, I'll hand over to the panel to introduce themselves, and I'll start with Willie Rennie on my left here.
Yeah, I'm Willie Rennie. I'm the member of the Scottish Parliament for North East Fife, and I speak in the Scottish Parliament on a whole Lib Dem means you have to speak on lots of things. And I cover social security and education in the main, but also I do housing.
Thank you.
I'm David Ross. I'm a councillor in Kirkcaldy, and I'm leader of Fife Council. And for my sins, I'm leader of the Labour group on the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities as well, which is the collection of all 32 Scottish authorities.
Hi, I'm Louise Reid. I am one of the members of academic staff who was involved in putting together the exhibition downstairs. This event is tied to that exhibition called Rewrite the Future. I'm in Geography and Sustainable Development. I'm one of the co-directors at the University Research Centres called STACS, St Andrews Centre for Critical Sustainability.
Thank you, Louise. So as we said, this event is part of the Rewrite the Future exhibition, which hopefully we'll have a chance to see downstairs. If not, it is on until Sunday, so there's plenty of time to come back and see that. So the exhibition explores how the choices that we make now can impact the future, whether that's about climate, community, technology, or equality. And the exhibition invites us to imagine different futures, and hopefully from the positive to the challenging, and think about what power we have to influence that future. So as a quick first question, if you don't mind, put your hand up if you think our future is already determined and out of our control. Nobody thinks our future is kind of predetermined. No one thinks that we can't control it. That's good. Hopefully we're all hopeful for the future then, and that we can inspire change. So we'll go to our panel discussion now, and we'll start with some big questions, some kind of big picture topics. And the first question I have for the panel, and ideally I'd like you to all answer this one. What is one action do you think Scotland could take in the next 5 years to ensure a fairer and more sustainable future? I'm not going to pick on one of the main ones to start. The big question.
Do you want me to go first?
Go for it.
It's actually about 1 in 5, sometimes higher, of the 16 to 64-year-old working age population are economically inactive. This is a different form of sustainability from environmental sustainability. But a country cannot run with more than 1 in 5 people who could work, not able to work. If you add that on top of the demographic challenge with the ageing population, then we are relying on an ever-shrinking number of people who are paying the tax to run the country. And unless we tackle that bit of the sustainability, we're not going to be able to have the financial flexibility to choose other things and make bolder decisions. And the country, in other words, is in danger of toppling over if we don't tackle that. Now, I'm for things like the child payment, which the Scottish Government brought in, but there is a danger that just covers up the weakness of the family unit and their ability to sustain themselves. So, of course, I don't want any child to starve. What we do need, therefore, is to give those families the tools to be able to sustain themselves. There's a group called the WISE Group, based in Glasgow, and they run a project which is called relational mentoring, and they go into households that are struggling, and they calm the house down, and they give each individual in the house the ability to go and do things for themselves. So they'll make sure that the child has got a space to study, to do well at school, that the father's got opportunities to go and get a job, the mother likewise, childcare opportunities are made available. So they bring order to the house in order for them to be able to sustain themselves. and therefore be in a position not to require a child payment in future. Because the child payment in itself is not sustainable. If we're still requiring so many children who are in deep poverty to require that payment, then the country is going to equally struggle to sustain itself. So I think we need financial sustainability, and in order to get that, we need families, individuals to contribute towards the well-being of the country. And then we're able to make the longer term decisions around about the environment and its sustainability, and climate change and biodiversity, and also dealing with international development opportunities across the world, bringing peace to other parts of the world. If we don't have the economic sustainability at home, we're not going to be able to do these things that we really want to do for the future.
So I maybe pitch in, and maybe I'm being a wee bit parochial here, but the one thing I would pick is actually creating fair and sustainable funding for local government, and local government over many years now has taken a disproportionate share of the cuts in public spending, and given the responsibilities that councils have, things about like social care, for housing, for education, for dealing with waste, and supporting local energy approaches, for instance, and planning. I think these are a lot of the things that actually really affect people's daily lives and you know the future as well. And I think, you know, I certainly think that you know, decisions and solutions to issues need to be responsive to local needs rather than a one-size-fits-all approach to, you know, across Scotland. And I think that's part of the issues we have. And if we have sustainable funding to support those vital local services, and there's room certainly as well. It's not just direct provision, although that I think is, you know, universal provision of some of these things is absolutely essential. It's also support to communities and community groups and the third sector as well, who in some instances can actually do things better than councils and will bring people, you know, together around that. And I think one of the problems that we've had, everybody talks about, actually we need to be it's prevention and early intervention to stop you running into crisis, but without you know, the kind of funding to keep yourself afloat, then it's very difficult to actually go into that kind of preventative thing and prevent just being reactive or, you know, waiting to a crisis point until you intervene. So you know, it's maybe a wee bit off the topic, but I think, and it's, you know, I certainly, I've worked in local government and I've been a councillor for probably 40 years. And, you know, I think it's the value of local government and engaging with communities and representing communities and being part of a local community is really important.
Thank you. And Louise, from an academic perspective?
It's hard to disagree with David and some of that kind of local focus, but I think a lot of the sentiments that David and Willie have suggested are about greater collaborative working, and I think that's what we've found in putting together this exhibition and working as a university, is that actually by working with other types of organisations, working with common ground participants, you know, people with lived experience of fleeing persecution and discrimination, that actually the space for collaboration needs to be prioritised. And actually many of the solutions, many of the kind of, I suppose, creative responses to thinking about how we deal with some of these really intractable problems, climate, social problems, we kind of know something about how to deal with them already, but we don't necessarily, we're not particularly good at sharing those knowledges and understandings. And I think universities have got quite an important role, hopefully, in trying to share some of those bits of knowledge. And that's what we've tried to do through this exhibition, is to showcase some of the kind of research ideas about what some of those solutions might be, to share them, but also by doing so, doing that in a really collaborative way. So working with local government, working with national government, people in the community, trying to put people together to think about what those solutions can be in a kind of creative way.
Great, thank you. And the next question sort of follows on from that. So to what extent do you think our current political system, and that could be at the UK government level down to a local government level, to what extent can the political system move fast enough to meet the urgency of things like the climate crisis or issues around social change? I think it's anyone.
Just pick up. I mean, I couldn't agree more with Louise. I've got written down here about collaboration and consensual approach, and it's about people, working together. And one of the regrets I have is that the politics in general, and even at a local level, has turned very confrontational and toxic. To be honest, and I think that inclusivity and collaboration, rather than what we seem to be seeing here is the cult of the personality and the kind of populism about Trump or Boris Johnson or whoever you like to pick out, which I think is a very unhealthy approach. And it's about everybody having a contribution to make, and how do we mobilise that rather than busy fighting each other all the time.
I adopt an approach in the Parliament where we hunt for agreement. And it's when you're in the opposition and you're hunting for agreement, it comes with a lot of risk, because we don't know everything that the government knows. So our resources, our research, our ability to understand the full risks in an initiative are much more limited than those who are in government or running administrations. So we're taking sometimes a leap of faith to back a party of the opposition with something in a constructive way. But we do it, but there is a danger when it all goes wrong, we get the blame even though we're not directly responsible. So that immediate political pressure is quite significant. A lot of my colleagues in other parties just hunt for disagreement. And that is quite destructive, because no matter what the position the government takes, the opposition takes the opposite view, which I don't think should be the position of opposition. I think it's to challenge, but it's to try and agree where you possibly can in order to move things forward. So we voted for the budget last year. We're voting for the housing bill over the next 3 days. And because we think it's in broadly the right place. But it's hard to do that collaborative bit when you don't know everything and you aren't ultimately in charge in a competitive political environment where that difference is important. So that's just to explain how it is really hard to do, but we try and overcome that. And I think David sees that at a local level, where some of his opposition colleagues will just disagree no matter what he says. And actually, I think there are much more nuanced positions required. And nuance is almost gone in politics now. You're either on one side or the other. When you take the position, I don't want to delve too much into, take the position of Israel and Gaza, then actually there is nuanced positions within that. But if you state that, you're condemned by both sides of backing the other. But actually, it's a bit more difficult than that. But it's too easy just to condemn somebody if they don't absolutely agree with you 100%. But nuance is really important in politics if we're going to try and navigate our way through things. I'm straying quite far from there. But just to explain how actually getting collaboration is really quite hard. Difficult to do.
And in response to that, then, is there a solution to that problem? How could government work together more collaboratively to solve these problems instead of fight with each other all the time?
Well, I mean, I'll give credit to John Swinney in the Scottish Government, because John changed the character of the Parliament when he came in. It was very hostile before that, and he managed to reach out to other parties and give them credit for when they did reach agreement. And he's not a shrinking violet, he'll tell people when they're wrong, but he actually has sought to achieve a more collaborative approach in it. But even then, he's finding it hard to do. But so it requires those at the top to give a bit, and it requires those in opposition to perhaps adopt an approach of hunting for an agreement when they can. So basically, it's down to individuals. It's not necessarily a structural thing.
Mhm.
It's the individuals who are brave enough to take risks by agreeing with others and giving a bit. That's what I think is required, because then you get long-term decisions. People who are prepared to look beyond tomorrow and actually realise that actually their job, if they've got to live with themselves, the job is going to be long-term.
Anything else from any of the panelists on this?
The political question, isn't it, about the urgency? I think in the past, COVID was a perfect example of how it was possible for political systems to change quickly and to be quite agile. I think what's sad about that is obviously it was quite a significant threat and it was a uniting threat, and I don't think climate change is seen in the same type of scale. I don't think, even though we probably are experiencing some of the effects of climate change already, maybe they're not registering as that. And I think that kind of visibility of a changing climate as a threat to our way of life isn't as well acknowledged, that provokes those types of responses yet. But the problem with that is that, the types of solutions do require quite a lot of build-in time, right? So changes now are necessary to prevent it from becoming like a really fundamental threat. I mean, we're kind of on the way that, sorry, I'm trying not to be too depressed, but I think we have seen in the past where political institutions are able to move cooperatively and quickly in the context of significant threats. I don't think we're acting quickly enough currently in the context of what we know about what's likely to happen.
Hunt for positivity. So we are building a massive new national grid. It's facing a lot of opposition, but we are building. We've closed down all the coal-fired power stations. They've all gone. And we are insulating homes to a level that was never insulated before. It is amazing. The standard now in new properties is just amazing. When you look at it, it's really thick and the houses are really warm. But the retrofitting is not good enough, but the actual new homes are to an amazing standard. The number of electric cars in this country compared with other countries is, I think, quite significant. Big difference here. We're building a network of electricity chargers across the country. I think the rail network in parts of it is pretty good. So I think there are some good things to talk about where I think we've come together and actually made a change. If you look at some of the community projects that are up and running, the environmental projects, there's a project in Cooper to try and deal with invasive species on the River Eden and to deal with the flooding in town. There's lots of things that are happening, and we need to be upbeat about those things that are happening to give us confidence that it is worth it. It's not enough. I get all that. But actually, you shouldn't say there's nothing happening, because there actually is quite a lot that's going on. So it's a challenge.
Well, no, it's just the pace and scale of it, really.
Yeah.
So I don't disagree that there's good stuff happening. There is some great examples there, but there's always more that we can do and we should do. And it's creating that appetite for change. And I think a lot of the benefits from many of these types of interventions are not just environmental, right? There's societal, there's benefits for jobs, for employability, for creative industries. Those benefits are there, ready, right? But there's much more that we can and should be doing at a greater pace, I think. And it is possible because we've seen it in response to COVID.
Let me give you a bizarre example, right, of the circular economy. There's a company in Cooper that creates dog treats out of spare parts of animals, right? And you think that has nothing to do with the environment, but it is, because all of those parts were going to waste before. But now, because of the drive to eliminate waste landfill waste. All these products are being recycled into a high value product for dogs. Now that's a industrial change that's happening all over the place. If you go to, my wife works in a company in Grangemouth that's creating acetone from the pot ale and pot ale from the whisky industry and potatoes. Now, acetone previously was a very high intensive energy product that was made, but because of the way that we're creating the incentives within industry, we're actually managing to eliminate waste, but also making sure that the products we produce are more environmentally sustainable. So there's a lot happening, and we need to tell people about these things to give them hope that it's possible rather than assuming nothing is happening.
Coming back to something that was mentioned before about people and communities, the exhibition takes a broad view of sustainability that isn't just environmental, but it's people and communities, as mentioned. So I'd ask each of you, which often neglected groups or communities do you think should have more of a role in decision making in Scotland?
I don't mind. I think one of the things we wanted to do with the exhibition, and you'll see this from the space downstairs, is to think about whose voices we often don't hear. So who are these marginalised groups that we often don't hear when we talk about climate change or social change or environmental change? And some of the groups that are featured in the exhibition below include young people, refugees, and people with disabilities. And I think if you look at the exhibition downstairs, we draw on research from across the university where academics have worked with these groups of people to explore what their experience has been in shaping the future, the extent to which their voices are currently heard, and what more can be done with these groups to kind of creatively think about solutions for the future. So what matters to these groups? How can we work with their needs and support their needs in terms of thinking about how we plan for services, for buildings, for thinking about institutions and the role that they can have in supporting those particular groups. So those are just three initial groups I think that we've tried to highlight through the exhibition to bring to bear their voices a bit more, recognising that they're often not heard when we talk about what sustainable futures are or should be.
Thanks. David, from a Fife Council perspective, are there any groups particular to Fife who don't often have or are not often given a voice?
I mean, I think you probably compile quite a long list, of all sorts of minorities and gypsy travellers. We have certain kind of sites that we're renewing. For instance, I think like carers, particularly young carers. Looked after children, again, that those are issues that are, for the council, quite major issues. And I think, there is quite a lot of discussion about how do we include people with lived experience in the decision-making systems. And I think it's sometimes I think it can be tokenistic about, we'll have a carer or we'll have a looked after child and on this board. And I think we need to be more imaginative, creative about how we engage with these groups. And I think you've rightly identified refugees, asylum seekers, people running from difficult circumstances and life-threatening circumstances in their own countries, and we can't ignore as well. And I think part of the driver for reform and some of the anti-immigration sentiment again is playing on the probably legitimate concerns and worries of parts of communities that see themselves being left behind and unfairly, I think, are looking for people to blame. And it's about actually we need to be talking to those communities and addressing some of their needs for employment, housing, etc., rather than lambasting them and labelling them all with the same kind of not treating them the same way as perhaps you would think about some of the leadership and the people that are trying to play on those fears. So I think there is a difficult balance to be struck there, and I think we need to be engaging with those. Personally, I think we should be looking at people as people wherever they come from across the world, and recognizing that we all face difficult experiences, and if we possibly can, we should be all working together to help each other and improve everyone's position there. But unfortunately, I mean, that's not the tenor of the debate currently.
I agree with all of that. I think there is another group that disengage intentionally, and those are the people who've just given up. They're disillusioned. They're not voting. They won't engage with the political environment at all. They'll not take their issues to politicians. They just have given up, and they've given up sometimes for decades, where they just don't believe in the political system anymore. And those people you have to work with really hard to get them to engage and discuss. There was actually one man who I met in a mining village in West Fife who wouldn't speak to me, refused to speak to me. So I ran after him down the street and forced him to speak to me. And eventually he said, "Well, my daughter lives in this block of flats and she's got a little girl, and on every other flat they've got drug addicts in it." And he was petrified for his daughter, and the council had done nothing to help him. And he felt completely lost. He wasn't going to engage with me until I harangued him to engage with me. But that's how I believe you have to work hard with people who are really, if people are shouting at you on the doorsteps or in the street, it's a form of communication. And we need to really work hard to get them to talk to us, because the political system is in danger of collapsing if we get turnouts of 35%, 40% for councils, and just above 50% for the Scottish Parliament, just above 60% for Westminster. I mean, that's terrible turnouts, and that in itself is a message to us about how we engage. So yes, all the groups that you've mentioned, but actually there's a growing group of people who think the political system does nothing for them. And I mean, David, you've maybe seen it yourself, but in some of the new housing estates, social housing estates that are built in North East Fife, the majority of the people in those don't vote. Brand new houses, the best insulated you get, the best standard houses, and they don't vote. And they'll say to you, "But what does the government do for me?" And actually your house. But there's a disconnect with that. So I know it's slightly left field, but I actually think we've got to work really hard at people who maybe work all day, get home, eat, sleep, go back to work, and don't engage at all with the system, or they're on benefits and they don't engage with the system. And those people we have to work really hard at, because if this goes on for much longer, I fear for the political system. I did that positivity earlier on, so it's meant to be negative.
So what's the solution? How do you
have to work, you have to force yourself to speak to them. Because I mean, normally what happens if people are not going to vote, they're not interested in them because they're not voting. And what you do for the long-term benefit, you need to do what I did, which is chase the man down the street and get them to speak to you and get them to tell you what the problem is. If people are angry at you, you need to find out why and try and solve the problems. And if people are, as I'm getting just now, quite a lot of people are very racist on the doorsteps, very open. And you've actually, rather than just blocking them off and having an argument with them, you've got to listen to what they've got to say and try and deal with the problems. I mean, I had one recently, which their issues actually were down to mental health and autism. And they weren't getting help from the NHS with it. And so we need to try and help them with their issues rather than effectively forcing them to blame somebody else for their problems, which is what's happened. So yeah, it's hard. but it requires us to understand that these people are not the enemy. These people are just suffering, and we need to try and help them with their issues. Otherwise, they'll go off in directions we don't want them to go off in.
So this is a question from slightly later on, actually, but it follows on from that quite well. Without being able to chase people down the street on an individual basis, how can politicians
chasing you?
how can the system rebuild public trust?
It is avoiding the trite comments publicly about what these people are and what they're saying. It needs to be understanding what their concerns are. And we find that there is quite a lot of mental health issues and a lot of autism and a lot of people waiting on long waiting lists to get into the NHS or really struggling to get a council house. And it's dealing with those fundamentals of life in order to allow them to build a happier life is what it's going to be. And that's the way, and it's just hard graft, which is why the big, bold change for the future is really hard, because you're still trying to keep these people engaged with the project of the country. When they themselves think, if I could just survive today, that would be good. But you're talking about, 40, 50, 100 years away, but I'm actually wanting to survive now. And we've got to do both. It's not possible to just focus on today. But some of these people really do struggle. And that's where we've got to try and tackle that, the fundamentals. So it's improving their lives. That's what we've got to do.
And I think that's, part of that is ensuring that the public services are as good as we can make them, despite all the pressures. And I suppose that's probably one of the most kind of soul-destroying parts of being a councillor and an MSP is when people come to you with a problem and you can see the problem, whatever, but you can't find a solution. Because there's priorities and there's a whole bunch of other people waiting for the same, the same council house or the same, appointment in the NHS or whatever. But I think it's not just providing the services, it's how the relationship as well with how you deal with that. And that's you never get it right. It's never going to be perfect. But you need to be understanding of people and sympathetic and do the best you possibly can, rather than just dismissing them and saying nothing I can do.
What was really interesting during the pandemic was that you would get council officers who were free from the bureaucracy of processes, democratic processes, of consultation processes. They did their things. And it was, for some people, it was really liberating, and they could, because normally they'd have a plan, it would take years, they'd be consulting it, it would eventually come back.
It's not that bad.
It can take forever. And sometimes by the time you got to the end of the process, everybody's moved on, or you've got a campaign group that's protesting against this move, whereas the officials just go on with it. Now, I'm not suggesting we should have a dictatorship. But actually, they felt liberated at the time during the pandemic. Some of the norms, the bureaucracy that we've created within our society was dispensed with, and they just did things. And politicians all rallied round and made it happen. And that was really quite refreshing in a way. But the consultation process now does suffocate things, David.
Well, it can. But I would argue back in 1996, when local government reorganisation took place and the three district councils, Dunfermline, Kirkcaldy, North East Fife and Glenrothes Development Corporation all came together under the one Fife Council. I think for 5 years there, we were actually really leading the charge in terms of consultation and engagement with people. And
too often
we've lost it. We've lost it. I know.
It comes a tip.
I know.
They kind of The officials know they've got a set number of questions, and you can see them in the meetings. They just sit there and they'll write things. They never engage, because it's quite a difficult environment sometimes. But it's like, people know the outcome before they even start it, rather than being a proper and meaningful engagement. Maybe we should go back to the 1970s.
Let's move some a little bit. So, and this might be touch on your specific research, Louise, about kind of homes, towns, and communities, and housing, which we've mentioned in a few conversations so far. Housing is central to sustainability. So, what would you do to prioritise making homes both affordable and environmentally sustainable for owners and also renters and social housing? Further solutions, are there any alternative models we could look at approaching that would ensure housing is more equitable for all?
You want me to kick off? Before I became leader of the council, I was our party's housing spokesperson. Housing has always been, important to me, because I think, having decent housing to live in, somewhere decent to live, is absolutely fundamental to your quality of life. You need that to get a job, to engage in education, to feel safe and secure, warm and well fed, or whatever. It's the basis that, and the bottom line, when we came into administration in 2012, the basic problem, if there is a need for housing, you need to build more houses, and it's as simple as that. And over the last decade, we've built, I think, nearly 6,000 new affordable houses, either housing association or council houses, to give people, the opportunity to have, a decent house. And we've had probably one of the biggest social housing, affordable housing building programs in Scotland, if not the UK. But it's not enough, and we've still got 1,600 people live homelessness cases, and they're not all kind of rough sleeping or anything, but they're insecure, either sofa surfing or insecure tenancies and housing in Fife. Yeah, and I mean the situation is the same, across Scotland, and that's what I mean. It's absolutely essential. I think that's why even the government, the Scottish government, has declared a housing emergency as well. We tackle that, and we put investment into building new houses. And I think the other aspect, and Willie, you mentioned it, earlier about insulation and the housing building standards, and that's absolutely great. And the new housing that we're building is to those higher standards. But we've got, as a council, we've got over 30,000 houses, and a good lot of them are quite dated. And it's been estimated that it would cost us £3 billion just to bring them up to what is a modern standard with retrofitting. And the way the finance works at the moment, it would be the tenants, many of whom are on benefits and unable to pay the full kind of market rents or whatever, who would be required to pay for that. So we just can't do it. And local councils across the country have said to government, it's not possible to get to the standards you want us to get to, unless there is proper investment from other sources. And again, I mean, I think you mentioned, Louise, as well. Building new houses actually creates jobs as well, and it's a win-win situation. So it is something, and that's we can do something about it, but not enough. And I think the other big question is, what about the private homes and people that are living in their own homes, but are maybe their incomes diminishing, they're older people on pensions perhaps, and can't afford to do this. So it needs a whole system approach to that. But I mean, just to finish on a slightly more positive note, I mean, there are things that we can do. So are doing about insulation, about introducing district heating and new building standards with ground and air heat pumps and things, and the new technology that can be more energy efficient, save us money, but also contribute to decent standards of housing.
I think I agree. I think retrofit's the really difficult bit to fix in the housing challenge. Retrofitting private rented sector and also owner occupier. I think there's pretty heavy regulation around RSL, registered social landlords, councils, housing associations, new builds. The kind of investment packages are maybe not as good as we want in those places, but they're much better than they are for retrofit in general. And I think the regulation is there as the carrot and stick is there, right, for those types of things. I think retrofit is a big challenge, and particularly in rural locations, far from market, where there's labour issues for doing some of those retrofit. There's issues around ownership, land, and access to infrastructure, which create particular problems in rural areas. I think the other thing, and this kind of, I wanted to pick up on something I said earlier about these groups that we identified in the museum, that these are not homogenous groups of people either, that the needs for these within these groups will vary quite significantly. And I think that, tying up with this question, I think having homes that are accessible is really important. We have an increasing aging population. People are living longer with more complex needs and health requirements, and many of them are, or increasingly people are trapped in their homes. They're not fit for purpose as they age. So I think there's a big question around making sure that homes are more accessible, and often that improving the kind of environmental footprint of a home goes hand in hand with these questions of affordability and accessibility, right? So when you make infrastructure improvements, when you're retrofitting, it's possible to also at the same time make them more accessible. And ultimately that makes them more affordable, right? Bills are cheaper. Typically you can stay there for longer with free personal care support at home. So I think those, for me, the key things I think we could do more of is really try and prioritise and invest in that retrofit agenda, but also in that accessibility. So making sure that homes are fit for purpose for a population that's aging with and living longer with disability, because I think often that gets missed in some of these important debates about making sure we've got air source heat pumps and things like that, which is important, but we shouldn't lose sight of making it fit for people in terms of their ability to be in that space and access all the rooms and use both doors and open windows and things.
And that was we're really keen to get across the next mission, so that's
Yeah.
design for a future sustainability.
Yeah, just believe, here blow the council's trumpet, but I'm happy to do it as well. But as part of a renewal of, the council owns care homes as well for elderly people. But one of the approaches that we've been taking is not only to build that care home that when people need that, but around it a care village. So there's kind of bungalows and things, people that are still able to, maintain living on their own, but might need some of the services that are available in the care home, and ultimately might want to transfer in there without going off somewhere else. And one of the most recent ones that we've built in Methil also includes a nursery as part of the care home, and there's a great intergenerational work. The kids go in and talk to the old people come in and help with some of the kids as well. And I think that kind of creative thinking, innovative approach is not my idea, but somebody else, but is actually really encouraging and helpful.
David, I agree with all of that. David talks about a whole system approach. The state can't do this by itself. We need the private investors to play a significant role, and that's private landlords as well as individual homeowners. We also need to create a system where people are living in the right homes. So the way that there's increasing scrutiny on this, and how stamp duty or land buildings and sort of the LBTT in Scotland plays. because the rates are quite high, and when you're already having an expensive move of a house, to have that additional tax is actually adding quite a lot onto the pressure to stay in your own home. So we maybe need to look at how stamp duty works as to whether we've got that right. But then the other issue is planning. How do we get a planning system that recognises that building on brownfield sites is really quite expensive to do? Retrofitting houses is expensive to do. It's much cheaper for developers to take a greenfield site and build lots of houses where there's very little inheritance of the or legacy from the site to cope with. So if we want volume of houses, but we also want to protect the green space, it's quite a challenge. And some of these brownfield sites would need some kind of incentive in order to build them. But do we have a lot of money to invest in brownfield sites that are necessarily more expensive than we need in volume? And also, we're wanting a high standard, and sometimes again it's easier to build a new home of a particularly high standard when you're dealing with a fresh piece of ground. So that planning challenge is quite significant. And we know here in St Andrews, we face a lot of pressure on the green space around about in the town, people want it to be built on. But if you're a family, a big family in St Andrews, you'll be lucky if you can get a social home. And it's very, very difficult. You have to live outside St Andrews. And do we really want that? Do we really want St Andrews to turn into that kind of town where working people live outside and it's only the better off that can live within the town? I'm not sure that's the kind of town that we want to see. So those are the additional challenges that we've got. So the number of homes, how well insulated they are, the amount of money we put into building them, the private sector, its incentives to invest in properties, and we've seen with some of the regulation that was muted recently that's deterred some of the private investors from coming in. All of those are it's quite a complex mix of issues that we need to try and grapple with. But I think the housing bill that we're voting on this week in the Parliament is in a better state now. And I hope that we get a bit of stability to allow investors to crack on and build the houses that we need, because it is a housing emergency. I mean, it's probably the biggest issue that I've got in my caseload for people desperate for a house. But equally, St Andrews has got the highest proportion of empty homes, not second homes or holiday lets, but actually empty homes. People who own properties but just do not use them for anything. It's the highest proportion in Fife. Why is that? In the best place to live, I would argue, in Fife. Why would there be so many empty properties? So we need to get on top of that as well. So lots and lots of issues. Housing is a fascinating area. It really is a difficult area. I'll give you another example. Passive housing. There was a big push towards getting passive housing. I wasn't in favour of it because it was actually getting to such a gold-plated standard of housing that it was actually so expensive to build every individual house. We were actually losing the volume that we needed of a high standard, maybe not the gold-plated standard, but a high standard. And actually, you didn't want to open windows. And sometimes people just want to open windows. So simple things like that. I think sometimes in politics we can let the perfect be the enemy of good. Sometimes that's what we do. I like to throw in a few provocative things now and again.
Thank you, everyone. That was really great insight into housing. There's a few other topics in the exhibition that I want to try and get through if we can. One of the key aspects of the exhibition is about kind of stories and advertising, and a little bit around greenwashing and misinformation. And that is connected to some of the things discussed, like personal heat pumps and insulation, solar energy, wind energy. There can be a lot of misinformation out there about these solutions. And so what actions, if any, could government or regulators take to address this misleading advertising and misinformation, particularly online?
It's hard explaining difficult things. It really is hard. It's and sometimes if you don't address it, if you don't address the detail, then people fill the space with misinformation. But if you do address the detail, you're actually not moving on to the issue that you need to move on to try and move the country forward. And that's the challenge we constantly face, is how do you address it? So there was a man the other day was saying that on the boats, there was, why is it all men that are coming across on the boats? Now, it's not something that I've ever really talked about, but it is. A lot of people who are on the boats are men that are coming across the English Channel. Now, that's because they care about their wives and their children, because they would never send them first, because it's a dangerous route to go on. But you never get the chance to explain that in a kind of a public debate, because you would never go into that space, because you want to talk about how do we build more houses and how do we create more jobs? How do we advance those things rather than constantly playing defence on issues that are difficult? But that allows, someone on the right just to fill that space and call them fighting age men. The loaded language of fighting age men is atrocious. And I was repeating some stuff earlier on that is just appalling language to describe human beings. But that's what the right does if you leave the space. So for us, it's a constant challenge that if you play defence and deal with all the arguments and all the rubbish that they come out with, you're never moving the debate forward. So it's a constant challenge for us. And the regulators face the same thing, because it's hard and sometimes it's detailed work to explain really complex issues, and people just turn off. Whereas the easy slogans of fighting age men, it's easy to distribute like that. So it is difficult to do. But actually what we need is people in communities to educate themselves and actually discuss it with their neighbours and their friends and their colleagues, so that they become part of the common understanding about all of these things. So if you hear the thing fighting age men, go and investigate, who are these people that are coming over? Why are they coming over? And talk to your neighbours and friends about it, rather than leaving it up to regulators and politicians all the time to make that case. Because it is with people that you trust in your community, opinion leaders, who actually shape public opinion more than politicians, I think. So it's really important that everybody takes this as an individual responsibility. We'll do our bit to try and deal with these things in that balance that I was talking about. But everybody needs to play their part in dealing with misinformation.
Anyone else want to comment on
I would say this because I work in a university, but I think education has an important role to play in giving people the skills to think about what credible information is and what inaccurate information is, and to begin to question where information comes from, what it's trying to do and why, so that when it is a case of misinformation, people themselves are able to judge that is a case of misinformation, almost irrespective of what any regulation may be. I think what we really want to do is create a society where people are engaged and are quite critical and thoughtful and are asking why this advertising or why this information exists, what it's trying to do, and not just take it at face value, but to reject it if it needs to be rejected, and to speak out against misinformation as well. Have the confidence to do that because they have the skills to understand what that information is.
It's that active role. It's really important. And it's difficult, because if you've got some loudmouth in the street who's spouting a lot of hatred, it's quite difficult when you've got lots of other things in your life to go up and challenge them and say, that's not right. This is the facts instead. It's a hard thing to do, but the alternative is that the loudmouth just dictates the agenda. They just take charge. That's the problem. But so it's uncomfortable stuff. But we are under. I've never known the issue of migrants and immigration come up more on the doorsteps than it's come up in the last year. we cannot think in Scotland we're immune from this because we're not. We've got lots of it here. And if we don't challenge it in the way we've just discussed, through education, through understanding, through discussion, through persuasion, if we don't do that, these people are just going to take over. They're going to be cataclysmic about it, but that's the truth. Okay.
David, you can add.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you mentioned the kind of social media platforms and whatever, and social media should be such a positive thing of allowing people to communicate and pass knowledge and, you know, exchange views and whatever. But, you know, so much of it seems to be descending toxic really at the moment. And I mean, I would hope, and I think we need to keep the pressure up on the providers, the social media platforms, that with AI and whatever, it goes over my head, I must say, but a lot of that, there must be ways of using that to actually manage out a lot of the kind of toxic things. I mean, absolutely, we need to maintain values of freedom of speech and so, but there are quite clearly things that are going on that are beyond the pale and need to be addressed and shouldn't have any place in any kind of media.
You know, the people I love are the grannies. The grannies are brilliant because they are moderate, decent people who just treat everybody right. And some of the grannies that I come across who just, they'll sit in the coffee mornings and will put the world to right. But they're common, decent people who explain things in a moderate and reasonable way. And I think we should put grannies at the front of the queue of this and resolving this challenge, because who would challenge a granny with a strong mind? They're very important.
Well, that leads me to my next question. Maybe you've just answered it for me, but briefly, what does a rewritten future for Scotland look like in 2050, in 25 years' time?
Good question again.
What does a rewritten future for Scotland look like in 2050?
I don't think it will be as bad as we are painting. I think it will be better. I think it will be better. I think there will be, you go in cycles, don't you, with these things, where it's people get exposed to these challenges and then common, decent human behaviour realises who are the frauds and it swings back again. There's a constant swing in politics and human behaviour. And it's making sure that we just don't go too far down that route is what we've got to try and do. But I'm more hopeful about the decency of human nature to deal with these things and realise that the challenges we face on the climate are something that we do need to act more urgently about. So the people who were flooded out their homes in Cooper can fully understand the pressure of climate change now, because they have to water inside their house. The farmers who have seen the yields from their barley plummet this year because of a lack of water out of the same river, also realise the challenge of the climate. So there's an example around one river sending messages to 2 different communities about the climate. And I think the more of those things that happen, that people realise that affects them directly, and it's not just other people in the future that will suffer, then I think the more urgent we will address these issues. So I'm more hopeful.
Yeah, and again, you know, wildfires, swings in weather and whatever. I think it will, you know, penetrate people's understanding and whatever. But you know, if you're asking what I would say, I've dramatically reduced, if not eliminating, in levels of poverty, and a vibrant, sustainable local economies, and benefit the community wealth building approach that keeps money circulating in the local economy to the benefit of everybody, and that we have made progress towards achieving a degree of sustainability in terms of net zero and biodiversity and all the other key kind of aspects on that. But I would be more optimistic as well in the long term that I think you don't, I'm with William in terms of, not underestimating people's fundamental decency in there of the vast majority of people, but also we shouldn't underestimate human ingenuity to tackle some of these issues that we're seeing. I mean, in my lifetime, I've seen people landing on the moon, computers, the internet, mobile phones, whatever. I mean, I certainly, when I was young growing up, none of that was there, and I can see that huge change. And there's no reason why we can't have the confidence that by putting our minds to it, we'll not address some of these other problems that we're facing over the next kind of 25 years.
And Louise, finally.
Well, I also had the word ingenuity. I was going to say that, but I think the thing for me is, well, the question is what type of future would we like to see? Really, I guess comes back to that point about collaboration. And I mean necessarily I kind of mean human collaboration with other humans, right? We've talked about that extensively, but I think also collaboration with the world around us as well, like respecting the rights and of the natures around us, not just humans, right? Of the necessity, the codependency that we have that across that kind of natural world with the human world, and to not see these as two separate things, but to be much more collaborative in our endeavours. And I think that is what I'd like to see a lot more, and I hope we'll achieve that in the next 25 years, 50 years. I think we'll have to.
Excellent. Thank you all. That's enough time for our prepared questions. I'll open the floor now to any questions from the audience. We have probably around 20 minutes for questions, so if anyone would like to ask, you can either direct your questions to an individual or to the whole group. Please put your hand up. Yes.
I'm wondering, like, having stewarded the process behind putting this exhibition together, like, what were the emergent things that surprised you? And then, I guess, what your sort of personal learnings were from stewarding that process and how it can be rolled forward into sort of bigger and more collaborative process like this.
Thanks, Charlotte. What surprised me? Right, so there's two parts to that question. The first bit is like what surprised me about the process of developing the exhibition, and the second bit is what I've learned more about through the process. Right. What surprised me? I suppose quite not any one thing, but I suppose the value of working across schools and units to do something. So I think Ross will correct me, but this exhibition in particular is one of the most collaborative ones in terms of the number and range of schools and disciplines and units involved. I think that's been a bit of a challenge sometimes for the museum to deal with that. But I think what surprised me is how well it's worked. I think people genuinely do want to collaborate on these types of big topics. They see importance in doing it. And I think there's a recognition that if we talk about academic disciplines, that no one discipline can solve any of these issues on their own, and that we do need to work across disciplines to do that. So that's been a nice surprise to see that many people have wanted to engage in that. And what I've learned more is, I suppose, a bit about the power of more imaginative, creative ways to engage people in some of these topics. So some of the workshops that have been really popular, like escape room workshops, and like some of the family events and the panel discussions and listening to the refugees and doing the refugee walk, is the value of some of museums, of public engagement events, of creative events, getting up at translating academic research in a way that other people find much more convincing than journal papers and funding reports. I think actually it's an often overlooked way of engaging with people and getting research out there, but it's actually really powerful in terms of changing minds and getting people curious about the world, I think. So yeah, I think that's maybe been the learning point for me.
Thanks. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm not sure if this is going to be a very well-formed question, but this morning I was having a bit of a debate with a friend about the new Gatwick runway. I know that's England, but I bring up that example because I was saying that obviously there'll be more emissions applied to the runway, and he was saying that it will create opportunities to grow the economy and possibly the planes on that runway could be run off low carbon aviation fuel, etc. maybe in the future. And he came to the point of regulation. Do we need regulation to ensure that, say, a new opportunity to grow the economy isn't going to lead to more environmental damage, more societal damage? The market isn't going to, sort of a question about the market as well, but isn't necessarily going to come up with all of the solutions. So my question is, can Scotland be more bold in some of the regulations that might be required to ensure that the growth that is needed is more sustainable, responsible? And can Scotland lead the way, because it's a smaller unit in a way than the Westminster or the UK government? Yeah, so a question sort of about regulation. How do we need to be bolder in our regulation to ensure we rewrite a more responsible future? And can Scotland be the leaders?
I mean, the pressure of, in difficult economic times, to snatch nets. So the Heathrow runway thing's been bubbling about for a long time, but probably now it's got the most sympathetic audience than it's probably had for 30 years because of the economically difficult times. And I suspect the Labour government will find it relatively easy for it to get through this next stage. But 10 years ago, Boris was going to lie in front of the diggers because the political environment was different at the time. And that, you could argue the same for oil and gas. The political environment around about oil and gas has led to a very confusing political environment for them. So one minute we're thinking about the climate and it's COP26 in Glasgow, and we're saying we're not going to exploit any more new oil fields. And the next minute we're concerned about energy security and Russia, so we've got to exploit everything we possibly can. Then the next minute we're concerned about energy prices, so we're saying how do we get the cheapest we possibly can? And if you are an investor in the energy world, you learn all this in the space of 10 years. How do you make long-term decisions about what's right? So that it's, I don't know how you create a regulatory environment around such a volatile environment. It's really, really difficult. So that's why you've got to have a set of standards. I believe, for instance, on oil and gas, for instance, and you've got to deal with demand reduction. That's got to be the priority focus, because that deals with energy security, it deals with the climate issues, and it deals with cost. So that surely should be our focus, but we get distracted by all the shiny stuff around it. So you've actually got to have a set of principles and stick to, no matter how difficult it is. And that allows the regulators to regulate effectively, because the regulators exist in the political environment around it. So I suppose I am asking for longer term stickability on these important issues in order to allow people to plan for the long term, which would lead me to believe that you should resist the pressure on Heathrow and invest instead on more sustainable routes. That's what I think we should do. But it's not popular to say that just now because we need jobs. So I'll probably not answer your question.
I think your question though was can Scotland be bold? And I think Scotland has been bold in the past. So I remember when I was a PhD student, the climate change bill was going through Parliament. You might remember this, really, and it was the first. Scotland was the first in the world, I think, first Parliament to pass a climate change act. So it is at that point. You know, but whether or not we've acted on it is a different issue. It's certainly possible for a Scottish Parliament to be bold in legislating. The issue is always delivering the legislation. Absolutely. But it's certainly possible to be.
We are world leading at setting targets.
Yeah.
honestly, when it comes to delivery, it's really hard because these things are hard. You're having to make difficult choices. You're having to upset people. You're having to deprioritise other issues, and that's hard. The Parliament's brilliant at setting.
Yeah.
So,
And running my council for me. Aye.
exactly. And we actually, what's even worse actually is we set targets and then ask somebody else to deliver it. And that's David.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I think you had your hand up first.
You've actually just answered my question before I've asked it, so I'm going to push you a bit further on that. So the idea of cross-party decision-making on longer term periods of time is the solution. How do we get?
It requires people to realise that unless they take difficult decisions now, their successors or even them will face an awful lot of more political pain themselves in the 10, 15-year period. It's almost immediate now. So it's realising that you might get a short-term benefit from doing something today, but actually you'll feel the pain later politically yourself. And that, I think, is going to be the realisation that this is not some long-term thing, this is now. And so unless we take action on the issue of flooding and drought, I'm going to have an awful lot of farmers and householders in my constituency who are going to be banging on my door demanding why I didn't do something. And it's going to happen. It's going to be within my political lifetime. That's going to happen. So it's in my interest to sort it out, irrespective of the greater good. It's in my interest to sort that out. And that will force politicians to work together. Now, am I hopeful that that's going to happen? I don't know. I mean, I've been in politics now, not as long as David, but for 20 years. And it's that some of my colleagues are only in for 4 years. So getting them to think longer term when their job might be under threat tomorrow is harder. But I mean, as I say, John Swinney, to be fair to him, was actually reaching out, trying to do some of that stuff and making longer term decisions. But when elections get closer, that kind of fragments a little bit. But that's got to be the thing, is that they realise that it's going to hurt them if they don't do it now. I think that might be wrong. So
I'm sold.
Thank you. Was there a question at the back? Yes.
So we were talking about like bringing people around to like new perspectives and wider like long-term perspectives through awareness and education, but there's been a steady rise of, along with the internet, misinformation, anti-intellectualism, as we've seen in like mainly in the US, of course, but it's definitely rising around the world as well. So how does education and awareness like bring people out of the state of inherent distrust of anything that sounds too quote unquote fancy?
yeah.
Does anyone want to pick that one up?
Over here.
So it's really about how do we challenge that global mass of information on the internet when people automatically distrust these days, because politicians have let them down, authorities have let them down too often. How do we challenge that? And I think it comes back down to people you know. I think it comes back down to people in your neighbourhood, your family, your granny, your grandmother that I was talking about earlier on. Those people are the opinion leaders in your life. And I know it's very granular and we're not talking about big solutions to deal with the big internet, but it does come down to, I remember we've not mentioned independence so far, so we've done pretty well. But during the independence referendum, it was really quite noticeable that people, I saw movement when I regarded as sensible, reasonable people in every community were starting to say they were supporting independence. And I thought we're in trouble now, because I was in favour of the United Kingdom. I thought we're in trouble now, because if the opinion leaders in every community are thinking that's okay, then others in the community will look to them and they follow them. I think the same applies on misinformation. I think if common, decent people who carry opinion in the street are vocal enough and confident enough to deal with these things, I think that's the way that you break it down. Now, how you do that on a global scale is mind-bending, isn't it? But you've got to, what's the environmental slogan? If you act, think global, act local, we've all got to take individual responsibility to try and deal with things. Now, the regulators and all that stuff will deal with certain things, but ultimately it's about community and it's about individuals who can actually start to turn that tide using common decency, common human decency to change.
I mean, I think it's also, and that goes from very local level all the way up to global, is if you're doing things that are seen to be successful, people will see that and appreciate it and start to copy. And hopefully, it's the positive, constructive things that are actually, having an impact, and that's what I would believe in.
I would maybe counter that slightly in that independence referendum was 11 years ago. I don't necessarily agree that opinion leaders are those people anymore. I think people are more likely now to listen to AI and people on the internet than they are to people in their community, because that community and that connection maybe that exists 11 years ago is less prevalent now, especially with younger people who are predominantly online. Maybe that community is not the same as it was. So I think
there's definitely challenges to it, there's no doubt. But I still think you have family and you have friends. You don't just live on the internet. There are other influences in your life. And good, decent people have actually got to realise that it's actually up to you. It's not up to anybody else. It's not up to some great government that's going to solve all the world's problems. Everybody's got a responsibility. And it's one of the things that frustrates me about commentators of politics is that there's just a general criticism about the political world and that there's nobody good in it anymore. And I'm not saying, we're the best at all, but they've actually, if you don't think we're good enough, you step up. You play up, because everybody's got a responsibility. We are not just some selected good people, and we've volunteered ourselves. I mean, it's, there are easier jobs to do in the world, I can tell you. But actually, if people don't think we're doing a good enough job, they need to step up and do stuff. And rather than commentate all the time, they should do it. Because everybody's got a responsibility to make this happen. But there is a tendency now for people to sit on the sidelines and sneer at politics, and that needs to change if we're going to deal with some of this stuff.
Can I just come back to something Louise said about the importance of education as well? And one of the things we're in the process of doing is rolling out iPads to every child in Fife, from P5, P6 up to senior level, and not just handing them out, but actually working with the teachers to integrate that in the learning. So that's the way they learn, with online stuff and whatever. And we, again, it's what I said about looking at things that are working, and there's probably 10 other authorities in Scotland that are already going down that route, and we've looked at some of them and say, hey, this is really what our kids need, and we're not going to have our kids left behind. We're going to do that. And I think that would actually, the way that they're using that, I hope will actually educate and equip kids to be much more discriminating about what they see online and how they use those kind of things. So things will change, I hope.
I think we have time for one more question. I think you had your hand up first.
Well, I was just thinking it's quite a big question, but rewriting the future in terms of how can we place the individual responsibility? So for the people that are able to do so, so you were talking about the people that have given up. How do we change their mindset so that they believe that they can do something to change the future, or they can, because I feel like a lot of people have given up due to the herd mentality that their voice won't make a difference. So how do we place back responsibility on an individual?
There's often a crisis, unfortunately, that sometimes, I mean, we saw with the pandemic that people changed. And you see it sometimes with big political campaigns. So you'll see round about, there's a whole generation of people who got politicized through the poll tax, you know, through the Iraq war, through events like that. So crises at different times often gets people involved and engaged. So that's one thing, is often, you don't want to hunt for crises in order to get people engaged, but that often does have an effect of engaging people. And I also think on an individual basis, and then again, this scaling that up is hard, but making sure that we do things for people, that they realise actually the state, politicians, the political environment can do things for them. So engaging, discussing, rather than just ignoring them, which is a tendency sometimes. So proper engagement with them has to happen as well. But then the final thing is individuals who are good, decent people making their views known. I mean, there used to be many more people who were involved in community organisations, did things in their neighbourhood. It was part of who they were. We need to make sure that everybody steps up and does stuff. So everybody's got a responsibility to try and influence others to be involved. So there's many different angles on it. It's not easy, you know, because otherwise we would have solved it by now. But those are the elements I think you need to put in place in order to try and deal with it. And that's what certainly I try to do.
I think in putting together the exhibition, we were quite careful that it's a really fine balance with individual responsibility, especially in some of these collective problems, right? Isn't it? Often the people who bear the impact of climate change, for instance, have not really had a big role in creating it, right? And I think through the exhibition, we had iterations of text, didn't we, where we thought quite carefully about that individual and how to locate them within the problem. And I think what you see downstairs is a lot of collective thinking about we, us, recognising that individual responsibility does have a role to play, but we're not all equal, right? We're not all equally responsible in creating some of the crises that we currently find ourselves in. And recognising a bit of that diversity so that, you know, not every solution or not everybody has the capacity to lobby their neighbours, right? But maybe somebody has the capacity to choose not to buy that product. So I think what we were trying to recognise in the exhibition is that actually it's about seeing ourselves not only as individuals, but actually as part of a wider collective, and that together we can achieve things, right? And that we've all may have different roles to play in that. Because I think what the academic scholarship tells us is that if we go too far down that route of individual responsibilisation, we end up with kind of cultures of blame and issues of cognitive dissonance where people don't feel absolutely powerless and or that it's their fault. And I think in the exhibition that was a very tricky line to balance around that kind of individual responsibilisation debate versus kind of collective responsibility. So I don't think it is as easy as getting everybody to step up, because I don't think for everybody that's possible. I think it's recognising that there are a range of things actions that people can do, and that those might be quite different according to the.
But it is realising that even the smallest thing, if lots of people do it, it has a tremendous impact. And too often people feel completely helpless and therefore do nothing. Actually, doing nothing is not the answer. Everybody's got to play some kind of role to try and change it. That you've got to give people hope that even just the slightest change is worth it.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that. I think it's quite a fine line from, you know, thinking about where responsibility lies often are not with those people that are disenfranchised, right? They're not the people, generally the powerful people in society that have shaped how we live our lives typically, that create the systems and structures and institutions. So I think it is a very difficult, I'm not disagreeing that everybody can play a role and they ought to be able to feel empowered to play a role, but there are people who have to take a bigger role than others, and we shouldn't be focusing on individual consumers necessarily who are disenfranchised without recognising that actually there's a lot that wealthy elites can and should do more of in terms of burdening that responsibility. So I have some sympathy with everybody can have something to do, but I think we need to recognise it's not a level playing field in terms of responsibility. And there are academic evidence does suggest if you go too far down that route, that is what disenfranchises people because they feel stigmatized and blamed for some of the situations that we're in. So it's a very tricky balancing act about how to.
I'm going to end our conversation there because we are out of time. Let's all put our hands together and thank the panelists for the evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to leave a little survey on this iPad at the back. It's just a little how you felt about today's event. It's a smiley face or a sad face or something in between. But if you've got any feedback for us, please do get in touch with the museum or pop back in. The exhibition is, as I said, until the end of this week, so do spend time and come back and see. Thank you very much.